Welcome to Innovation in Government from AFCEA International's TechNet Cyber 2023 in Baltimore. I'm your host, Francis Rose. The theme of this year's event is the urgency of action, focused, aligned, and ready. Leaders from U.S. Cyber Command, DISA, and the Department of Defense, as well as industry, came together at TechNet Cyber to work towards solutions for cyber challenges. Speakers and attendees used terms like zero trust, resilience, and partnership a lot at this show. Over the next hour, you'll meet leaders from both government and industry and learn more about meeting the complex security challenges in today's digital landscape. We begin with Brian O'Donnell, Vice President at Carahsoft. I asked him what themes he heard most about at TechNet Cyber.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is my third show in 3 weeks. I was out at HIMSS in Chicago 2 weeks ago, largest healthcare show of the year, and it's obvious, cybersecurity is top of mind. And, they really do need help finding solutions. And then I was out at RSA last week, largest cybersecurity show of the year, thousands of exhibitors, right? Customers can get overwhelmed when they walk through the halls. And then this week, good opportunity to have government and industry together again, talking about government challenges, how industry can help. So, the trends we're seeing, there's a lot of talk about AI at all three shows. On both sides, right? How are adversaries going to use AI, to become more sophisticated, and then how do we incorporate AI into the tools to help solve those problems? So that's been the number one theme I've seen so far.
Yeah, that integration of government and industry on both sides, we talked about it as collaboration for a long time, and it seems like integration is, maybe if people aren't using that term, that seems like more of the feel of what's going on here. Is that something that you're seeing?
I think there's been talk about government and industry partnering together for a long time, right? But I don't think I've ever seen as much collaboration or willingness to partner than we've seen recently, right? And we see that what's happening with, the JCDC at CISA and, a couple other consortiums of groups coming together to discuss these challenges and come up with the solutions.
What's driving that, do you think? The reason that I ask is because I wonder if we can see if it's a trend or see if it's something that maybe is kind of an anomaly and we'll go back to what we've seen before where there was a little bit more of a standoffish relationship.
I think there's some of the bigger initiatives that are driving that, right? I think customers have big problems to solve. I think they're seeing that they can't solve those problems with any one vendor, right? So, we've been big believers of this better together concept where we're seeing vendors come together, bundle their products with others, and deliver solutions, right? And we take zero trust, right? A lot of talk about zero trust here at this event, both on the stage and in the exhibit hall. And no one single vendor can deliver zero trust. So I think it's really just that acknowledgement that it's going to take many of us to come together and deliver that solution. So I think that's driving the government willingness to partner with industry.
So you talked about some of the shows you've been to just recently. What do you expect to see trend line wise in the shows that you'll go to and just the way that your partners are serving government in the coming months, year?
I think in the coming year, we're going to see a lot of what we're seeing now, right? I think the emergence of AI, right? I talked about that being sort of the overarching theme. That's been true of the shows the last couple of weeks. I think that's going to continue to be, true going forward. Just the power of AI on both sides of the equation. So I think that's the number one trend now. I think that's going to continue throughout the year. We talked zero trust, right? The breakout sessions around this conference have all been centered around zero trust, right? On, the keynotes today, they talked about, their path to get there in the next couple of years. So I don't think this is going away. I think this is something that we need to continue to work on.
A lot of discussion about zero trust through the course of the next hour on this program. How long do you expect that timeline to be? I mean, it seems like we're at the very beginnings of this journey.
Mr. Sherman talked about it on stage today, and they have a path to get there by 2027, right? So if you think we've got the next 4 years to build and deliver solutions, we're seeing a lot of good technology, like I said, come together. I think we're coming up with good ideas now. I think we're going to start to see those implemented, and I think that goal of getting there by 2027 is real.
Brian, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks, Francis.
Brian O'Donnell of Carahsoft at TechNet Cyber. Military cyber leaders were a big part of the discussion at TechNet Cyber. The Navy's principal cyber advisor, Chris Cleary, explains the concepts behind the service's cyberspace superiority vision.
You know, when you traditionally have the conversation about cyber, most of the time it's followed by the word security. You know, we even look at the conference we're at today, the majority of capabilities we see in this space are traditional kind of enterprise IT security things. Well, when you look at cyber as a spectrum across what a service or a department would be interested in, you really had to open up the aperture and you had to look at the other things that we have to be expected to do in this space. You know, fighting hurt and delivering effects in and through the space is really where you got the secure, survive, strike mantra. Secure, as the name implies, is really everything, once again, that is in here. Zero trust, identity management, RMF reform, cloud security, all the blocking and tackling. The survive bucket was really about this idea that, you know, the adversary gets a vote. Sometimes all the capabilities in this room, even if perfectly deployed with an environment where your workforce is perfectly trained, is going to figure out a way around it, or is going to figure out a way to deliver effects in places that you maybe haven't anticipated. So how do you learn to fight hurt? We think this mostly through the lens of things like operational technology, ashore, afloat, weapon systems, things that don't traditionally, or up until recently, haven't fallen in that enterprise IT space. Yes, there's computers there, but we never saw it through the lens of, let's say, this environment. So we're opening up the aperture. And then strike, as the name would imply, you know, we're a military service. You know, our job is to deliver effects when directed in and through this space. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Army, the Air Force are all going to look for capabilities to deliver warfighting advantages, warfighting effects non-kinetically. We traditionally haven't spoken about this, and I would admit that in some instances, some of my colleagues cringe a little bit when I want to talk about the strike world. But it is a place that we have to learn to have an open conversation. We're not going to talk about specific vulnerabilities. We're not going to talk about how we're developing some of these capabilities, but conceptually, how the strike side or cyber as a warfighting domain fits within the Department of the Navy's force design is something that we should be able to have at the unclassified level to conceptually talk through the idea. So again, secure, survive, strike really covers the waterfront of the majority of things that we would need to do across the entire spectrum in the domain.
Part of the time that you're spending here is on a panel with your counterparts, the principal cyber advisors for the other services. Do those concepts that you just described, zero trust and all of those others, do you think they apply the same to your peers in the other services that they apply to you in the Navy?
So once again, the cybersecurity stuff, yes. All the services, to include the joint staff, are 100% behind, you know, the zero trust foundation, the strategy being led at the DoD CIO level. So 100%. We're all embracing the needs for identity management. RMF reform and ATOs is always a sensitive subject. Everybody knows it needs to be fixed. So I'd say that there's certainly cooperation and collaboration in those areas. To use just the secure, survive, strike mantra, we have come together just recently, and earlier today we were at the Applied Research Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University talking about OT security. So there is and the PCAs have really been the catalyst of trying to get the services to work together. Hey, this is a good idea. The Navy was the service sort of leading the OT ashore or afloat story, but it's consistent, or it's common to us all. Why can't we all get around one conceptual architect or something that we're calling mosaics moving forward? So we've all begun to sort of slap the table and say, hey, this is probably something we should all invest in. It's common to us all. And then when you get into the warfighting side, well, we each do it a little bit differently. You know, the Navy and the Marine Corps are expeditionary, you know, traditionally forward deployed organization. However we would embrace certain capabilities might look a lot different from the way the Army or the Air Force would go after looking for similar capabilities. But we all have that same, you know, mission requirement. That's probably the area where there's probably a wide variance of how we would go about that mission set.
News reports that a new cyber strategy is coming from the Navy. March was the original timeline, now sometime in May appears to be, as the reports that I'm seeing at least. What will be the intersection of that, or what will that deliver that the superiority vision kind of laid the groundwork for?
So the Secretary of the Navy, when he came into office, even he recognized the need for some higher, at the Secretariat level, guidance of how we should be doing this. At the time, he commissioned myself and Aaron Weiss, who was the CIO at the time, to write a cyber strategy. We did. But in good keeping with, you can't get ahead of your boss. In this instance, our boss is the Secretary of Defense. We are waiting appropriately for the Secretary of Defense to release their cyber strategy, which we have seen and read, and then we're making sure that ours is in alignment with theirs. So the other Department of, the Department of Defense will sort of set the tone, which comes from the President of the United States. So we're in alignment with the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. Our strategy, of course, rewriting it a little bit to make sure that it's in line with the themes that are our bosses have sort of put out. And in good order, we will, when OSD releases theirs, we will release ours within a very, very short time frame right afterwards. But we're kind of in a holding pattern appropriately to make sure that we are in alignment.
Anything that one would expect to see in that will surprise someone?
So yes and no. I would say this is where the superiority vision comes in, which is the thing that we could submit before the strategy came out that gave kind of a hint at what the strategy was going to look. So the traditional, I'll call it cybersecurity strategies have focused mostly on, once again, the things you're seeing here in the room. We are opening up, not that these things, there's nothing unique, you're not going to see anything earth-shattering in it, but it is going to be, how do we acquire capabilities and present it to our cyber forces that we're going to have in this space? How do we work more closely with the defense industrial base? How do we recognize the dependencies that we have on things that we maybe don't control? And then the two, which is going to be line of effort 1 and 2. Line of effort 1 is workforce, which is going to go across all the civilian as well as military components. And line of effort 2 is this idea, which Aaron Weiss started in his tenure as the CIO, of the Cyber Ready Initiative. How do we change our culture from doing one, which was that of mostly based around compliance, to it's just the way that we do business. And then, the rest, you're going to, there's head nods to warfighting, there's head nods to operational technology, whether ashore or afloat, things we haven't traditionally considered. And then, you're going to look at it and go, yeah, this is pretty consistent with what we would envision a strategy to look like, incorporating some things we haven't maybe traditionally spoken about before.
I want to go back to the cybersecurity superiority vision. You talked about strike as the third component of that. And I'm struck by the fact that there are a lot of people, as you said, in the department that are hesitant to talk about it, and yet it seems like everybody else seems to recognize, yes, it's a capability the government has, the military has, and yes, it's a capability they should have.
Yeah, and I'll admit I'm a bit over my skis in this one a little bit. Even I was born into cyber out of the intelligence community. And if you look at where cyber really traditionally originated, it was born out of places like NSA and CIA, who were doing it from an exploitive standpoint for decades. And as we matured in this space, and you even saw it with the creation of US Cybercom, living under the National Security Agency, a lot of the capabilities that we leveraged, of course, were born out of those agencies. So the culture there is one of secrecy, of Title 50, of I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you sort of mentality, right? All those jokes we've always said about the intelligence community, and I get it. There's people that have created their whole lives, have grown up in that space, and there's some validity to it. By all means, I don't think that we should talk completely openly about the topic either. But with the creation of US Cybercom in 2010, with the invention of the mission forces circa 2016, 2018, we began to acknowledge openly that offensive cyber operations was a legitimate mission space within this thing we were going to call the mission force. So if you're going to have a legitimate acknowledged mission of offensive cyber operations, it shouldn't be that much of a leap to think that you're going to be looking for capabilities to enable that stuff. Now, because there are sensitivities to how we look at these tools, the vulnerabilities that we would want to exploit, the tactics, techniques, and procedures we would use to deliver these, lots of sensitivity around that. But just like there are around stealth technology with aircraft or the unique sound profiles of submarines, there's lots of things we don't talk about openly, nor should we. But we acknowledge that we have a thing called the Columbia-class submarine. We know what it does. We know what it's designed to do. We're not going to tell you how it works, but we openly talk about how that platform fits into the larger force design of the Navy and why we acquire things for it and why we develop technologies around it. I think that kind of conversation is something that we need to begin to have in this space. I think we're at the point where we're mature enough to have it, that there is a Title 10 organization in the DoD, which is always a little more forthcoming in how they do business, not the Title 50 Intel world. And there's enough of a center of gravity now around that community where it is appropriate to have open conversations of how industry is going to come and support the development of capabilities to enable that entire mission space.
Chris, it's great to talk to you again. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
The Navy's principal cyber advisor, Chris Cleary. Chris touched on the emphasis on zero trust in the Navy, and that emphasis applies across the Department of Defense. I asked Eric Trexler, Senior Vice President for U.S. Public Sector at Palo Alto Networks, to review the components of success in zero trust.
So I think they're the pillars of zero trust that we talk about often. But I think what gets lost in the messaging is the business value. Why are we doing this in general? What are we trying to solve for? And it's really better protecting data and our personnel, our transactions, our applications. But there's a business mission requirement behind that. And that's so critical that we focus on that. It gets lost 9 times out of 10 in conversations we have.
What would bring that back more effectively to the forefront of that conversation, Eric?
I always encourage my peers, my partners, our teams to go back to why are we trying to secure this part of the mission? What is the business outcome? Are we trying to ship equipment over to Ukraine? Are we trying to do something in the Indo-PACOM AOR? Why are we doing this?
From a cultural perspective, it seems to me that's beneficial too, to be focused on the mission delivery and the end user rather than the technical stuff behind the curtain, right?
It absolutely is, because it's not a product problem. Zero trust is a foundational way of changing the way we think, or an architecture, if you will. It's not about products. There's no zero trust product out there, despite what industry says all the time. You'll see zero trust all over the place. It's not a product problem. You're trying to solve a mission requirement.
Is that an indicator then, if somebody's offering a zero trust thing, that that's not something that's potentially useful to somebody in DoD?
Well, if that's your disqualifier, everybody's out.
Okay.
Everybody's talking about zero trust.
Right.
But again, go back to why are we doing this? I was at RSA a couple weeks ago, and it was chaos. And it was all about zero trust and AI. But nobody was talking about why. Few people were. We need to get back to that core message.
So I guess that's encouraging to government users if the private sector companies that go to something like RSA are struggling with this concept of why with zero trust. I guess it's okay that government is too, but what gets around that obstacle? What gets back to answering that why question?
So I really think going back to what we're trying to secure, why we're trying to secure it, what the mission is, what technologies we can then bring in to do that. You know, those are critical components of zero trust. It's much more than what we're getting from NIST or CISA or DISA or any of the others. What are we trying to do here and why? How do we make it a more secure environment? How do we drive things like better user ability, user capability, accessibility, ease of use, while increasing security as we modernize our systems? I think modernization, I think automation, to me, those are all core components that you have to consider when you're talking about zero trust.
We don't have time to go into every technology that it is going to be incorporated into an effective zero trust strategy, but do those technologies all exist and it's a matter of putting them together, or is there some missing piece that still needs to be figured out by either industry or government or some combination thereof?
So they do exist, and partnerships are required. Coming from RSA recently, there were over 3,000 vendors reportedly on the show floor. I don't know how you'd figure out who to work with if you tried. The other thing we see a lot of is the customer tries to be the integrator. It is much better when we industry consolidate at the factory floor than when a customer tries to bring multiple vendor solutions together and make them work. So partnerships are critical, and also looking at, we believe, the larger platform vendors as opposed to the technology du jour. I can't tell you how many companies I did not see at RSA this year and how many I saw for the first time. And I promise you, next year, a lot of the ones I saw for the first time will not be there again. So you've got to make strategic bets.
In making those strategic bets, what does a government person look for? What should they be analyzing to try to make the right bets so that they're with somebody who's in it for the long haul too?
I would look at size, scale, proven track record. I would talk to companies about R&D. We're putting more R&D than the next more than double the R&D of our next closest competitor. We're investing in the cybersecurity space, and those are big dollars. These are important components to look for when you're not looking to roll out just a product technology and you need something. In the government, 10-year programs are the norm. Right?
Yeah. So if this is a journey, and everybody seems to call it a journey, and I think that's apt, what does that journey look like 2 years from now, 5 years from now? There's obviously no end state if it's a journey.
It's a continuous walk. We're constantly iterating and getting better and better and better. Zero trust usually, in my opinion, starts with identity. That's kind of the foundation, because if you don't know who your users are, it's really hard to protect your data, your applications, and your users. So you start there, and then every agency, every organization has its own journey that it's going on, its own prioritization. The best advice I can give is work with your industry partners. Help them understand where you are, where you want to go, take best practices from them, modify your plans accordingly, and then work against that plan and constantly iterate.
Eric, there are lots of timelines and lots of deadlines associated with all this zero trust rollout, not just in the Defense Department, but across the civilian sector too. Who's doing it well that other agencies could emulate wherever they are in their zero trust journeys?
Well, I'll give you an example of a large DoD agency. We're at up in Baltimore at TechNet, and DISA, rolling out the Thunderdome program, is really doing modernization well and cost reductions, looking at reducing the JRSS stacks, which are a massive expense, while modernizing and driving ease of use for our customers. It'd probably be the first one I'd think of, especially where we are today. They're doing an excellent job of bringing commercial capabilities to the Defense Department.
Is that an example of having to fix the airplane while you're flying it too, because they've got to keep all these networks secure, they've got to stay on JRSS to the degree that they're on it in the midst of that transition, right?
It absolutely is, and that plane is landing, the JRSS plane, in 2027.
Yeah.
It's in the program. That's funding and everything really curtails in 2027. So they have a quick time frame, and the great thing about modern commercial technology, you can bring users on very quickly.
Eric, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
Eric Trexler of Palo Alto Networks at TechNet Cyber. The Defense Information Systems Agency is working on the rollout of the Joint Warfighting Cloud Capability contract as a multi-cloud platform. Dave Donnelly, Area Vice President for DoD and Aerospace at Splunk, told me what he expects to see as the department executes on JWCC as a multi-cloud platform.
There are so many challenges. I always think of the Donald Rumsfeld or unknowns situation. From our perspective at Splunk, we think about things from a visibility, security monitoring perspective. And I see that's probably one of the biggest challenges. Spent some time talking to the CIO, Mr. Sherman, and I know they're committed to the strategy. It makes sense, but that's probably one of the biggest challenges we see as the environment rolls out. How do I see across all four clouds?
Yeah. What does that mean for the end user, and what does that mean for the cloud program managers in each of the organizations as they sign on to the contract?
I think from an end user perspective, it's, user experience is something they constantly talk about as a major concern. I know the department, that's probably one of the biggest focuses they have. So how do you put zero trust around this cloud environment, ensure that folks have access, but also have the ability to get their job done? I mean, just let's be practical. If it's really difficult to get to applications, to use them, and to execute in your assigned role, then that's not good. So I think, again, that's part that has to be figured out.
Okay, so I think you asked it as a rhetorical question, but I'll ask it as a real question. How do you put zero trust into that environment, given that John Sherman and others are so committed to that concept too?
It's not a single tool or a platform. It is collaboration. They've invested heavily, the department's invested heavily in best-of-breed security and monitoring tools. So with zero trust, DISA put out a policy, or framework, So how do we, using that framework, take advantage of all these investments that the department's made over the last few years? And I think, how do you do it? I don't exactly have the answer, but I think if industry looks at the framework, tries to work within that, that they can effectively get there over time.
It's a word that I'm hearing a lot on the floor here, and that word's resilience. And you and your colleagues at Splunk have talked about it a lot over the years that I've been in this space. What does resilience look like in your view in this multi-cloud world that we're talking about?
Yeah, so we talk about digital resilience often. It's really evolved well past redundancy, right? That's 10 years ago thinking. It's more understanding if the applications that you're trying to use are 100% uptime, if the end user, back to that user experience, is able to accomplish the task they need to. And then finally, from a resilience perspective, is DoD owns a lot of legacy network, legacy applications. They can't all be replaced, in a short time frame. So resiliency also looks like pulling those capabilities in to modern cloud computing where it makes sense, and where it doesn't, having kind of a hybrid strategy to take advantage of both environments.
Yeah, I think the operative phrase in what you just said is where it makes sense, because for a long time I think there was at least a belief everything's going to go to the cloud someday, and I think not everybody thinks that's the case anymore.
Right, it just does not always, it's not always practical. And I think that's what everyone's starting to understand, where it makes sense, have a good, strong cloud strategy, a SaaS strategy. But in certain environments, classified environments get very complicated, special access programs, things like that. A cloud may not be the right solution. But again, I see the department as they work through, like doing a better job of assessing what can go where. Yeah. And that's just really a big part of it, is understanding that assessment, what that looks like.
The discussion around cloud and the discussion around zero trust always attaches, just about always attaches the word journey at the end. What do you think this journey looks like at some future point as JWCC becomes a mature concept and the departments, the services have signed on and so on, zero trust becomes more embedded into the way that organizations do cybersecurity inside the Pentagon? What do you think these journeys look like for these people?
I think the journey's probably longer than we want it to be, but then again, the DoD's been around for quite a while. So if something might take industry 2 or 3 years, it may take the department 7 or 8 years to do it. So I think that's probably the biggest thing to be aware of, is it really is a journey. This isn't something that we're going to sprint to. It's going to take, again, quite a few years and a lot of learning about things that work, especially in the cloud environment. Users, you've got, especially in the Defense Department, you've got tactical people out in vehicles, planes, ships. So is it always going to work for them? There's a lot of learning that's got to come with that. And I think that's probably the toughest part of the journey. Is enterprise networks, sure, it's easy, but what about all those folks at the tactical edge? I think that's part of the journey we still have to learn.
Less than 30 seconds left. Back to visibility that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. What do you think that looks like at some future point? What are people able to see that they've realized that vision of visibility?
So right now what they can see is probably really limited, and I think that's one of the challenges, again, from the CIO on down. Are, if I look out, can I see my cloud readiness, my uptime, my availability? Yes, but there's so much more complexity in the cloud, microservices and things like that, that they're going to want to have that. And again, like you said, in a multi-cloud environment across all of the clouds that they're running their applications in.
Dave, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
Dave Donnelly of Splunk at TechNet Cyber. When the program continues, leaders from Defense Innovation Unit and more will join me. Innovation in Government will be right back. If you want insights from agency and industry leaders on the latest topics in technology, management, workforce, defense, and acquisition, sign up for the FedGov Today podcast with me, Francis Rose. I release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, so you'll stay up to date on the issues that matter most to federal government leaders. Listen at fedgovtoday.com and everywhere you get your shows. Don't miss out on the conversation. Follow the podcast today. Welcome back to Innovation in Government. The Defense Innovation Unit is some of the most important connective tissue between emerging cyber technology companies and the Defense Department. Kate Stowe, the Defense Engagement Team Cyber Lead at DIU, joined her colleague Johnson Wu on a panel about connecting companies and DoD. I asked her what message she wanted to convey on that panel.
I think our biggest message is, who the heck is DIU? What I find is that we go out and we meet people and they just really don't know who we are, that we're a government organization. They see innovation and they think that we have some product or something like that, where really we're there to help our DoD customers get on contract with non-traditional commercial companies. So yeah, it's just spreading the message and evangelizing DIU and what we can do to help.
What is the best way for you and your colleagues at DIU to find that innovative technology that you're supposed to be the connective tissue between those companies and the department?
Well, so one of the things I find really as a differentiator is that we have the commercial engagement team. I know that Johnson Wu for the cyber portfolio, he was here with us at TechNet, talked to you as well. The fact that he comes from industry and he has that background, he has that vocabulary, he has that network, that is how we are able to connect with those commercial companies and seek them out and do really true market research, which I think is something lacking in the traditional acquisition community.
What do you look for in innovation? Is there a definition of it, or you just know it when you see it?
So I don't know if we're looking for necessarily innovation.
Okay.
We're looking for the right tech to solve our problems. And you know, innovation gets a little bit of a buzzword around it, but to me, the innovation is how we contract and our process, but the things we're looking for is the right technology that can meet our needs. So
DIU stood up. One of the reasons it stood up originally was because there were companies out there like the ones that you're describing that either didn't know how to do business with DoD,
didn't want to,
or didn't want to, is the other thing I was going to mention. What's that trajectory looked like to you over time as far as addressing both of those issues?
Well, so as a traditional program manager for the Air Force, I think that I see how hard it is to work with us. And so one of my goals is that we are changing the culture and the way that we acquire. And that's where I see some value of DIU. We're doing it in the work. We're teaming with program offices now, teaching other program managers how to do this. We've lowered the barrier to entry for commercial. We're changing the way that we look at industry, saying these are our partners. We're going out, and when we have a problem, we're going out to industry and seeking them and saying, hey, we have this problem. We think you could help us. You know, send us look out for the CSO, right? Versus us sitting back and saying, hey, we're the government. Here's SAM.gov. You know, build an army of people to scour it to find something that you can help us with. Send us an 80-page free information. We'll maybe read it. You know, it's a very different mentality, and one I think that we need to adopt as an acquisition community. And that's how I think creating a process that helps industry work with us faster, easier, on their terms, and then also changing our mentality about how we work with industry.
You kind of anticipated my next question, which is how much of your demand signal is from the department saying, hey, we need this if you can find something that will solve this problem, and how much is, like you talked about here, vendors coming to you and saying, here's something that might work for someone in the DoD?
I think it's a bit of both. I think the demand signal from the DoD customers has been slower or less or quieter because they're unaware that we exist. The more that we are out there in front of the PEOs and going to DAU and educating and doing all of those things, the more we're seeing the government customers reaching out to us. I got here and I wonder, I'm like, why are we not at the point where we have to turn people away? You are free, DIU is free help and we're a force enabler. We're a tool. We're resources that they don't have to pay for, and so we're not utilized as much as we could. I think it's just because we went to the operators first as a unit, and I think that we've recognized we need to go to the acquisition community as well. And so as we've done that, so that demand signal is ramping up for sure. And then industry is, again, the more they learn about us, the experiences that they're having that are positive, that kind of is ramping that side up too. So yeah, but we really need those government customers. That's who we're trying to help, and as a result, we help the industry guys as well.
One of the things I talked about Johnson with on the podcast at fedgovtoday.com is the fact that DIU, I think a lot of people thought at the beginning it was a technology hub, and it's become as much an acquisition place as a technology hub. You just kind of alluded to that a moment ago.
Yeah, it really has. Like I said, it is through the work, teaching and showing that there's a different way to do this and that we can do it that way, and focusing on the acquisition community, because really they are the ones that are going to move it to transition and into sustainment. They're the ones that are going to put it into a baseline. The acquisition community is the ones that are going to adopt it, frankly, because they're the acquirers on behalf of the operators. But it frankly doesn't do us a lot of good to go to an operator, get them a new capability that fits their need today, then they turn to their sustaining organization or acquiring organization and says, hey, I just got this and I want you to go put it in our baseline. And the acquisition community turns to the operator and says, we haven't pawned for that. That's not in our budget. Where do you think I'm going to come up with this money? That's not part of our plan. That's not in the contracts we already have. It can be almost negatively disruptive. So by bringing that community into that discussion, so an operator comes to us, says, this is a gap that we have a need. My first question is, who is the acquiring counterpart for you? What PEO supports this type of a capability, no matter what service, because we're joint? And then it's like, okay, let me find someone in that organization and bring them into the conversation from the beginning.
We talk at this show a lot about sustainability and resilience, and it sounds like that applies equally in your case to the acquisition community and the acquisition aspect of this technology as to the technology itself.
Yeah, it definitely does. This is something, we're in this for the long haul, and we really need to change the way we talk, change the way we acquire, change the way we work with our operational community. I love at DIU that our program managers are operators. I started out as an operator before I became a program manager, so that in itself is a very different way of doing business. And then they're teamed, so they're teamed with acquirers. So I say to people, like, we're all about meeting the warfighter need. We've got operators, we've got industry expertise, and then we do a little acquisitions. Like, it needs to be, that's our focus, and acquisitions a supporting role in that.
Kate, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Kate Stowe of Defense Innovation Unit inside the Department of Defense at TechNet Cyber. The Defense Department's working on a number of important cyber and modernization initiatives at the same time. I asked Matt Robertson, head of public sector channel at Atlassian, what the important pieces of all those initiatives are.
We look at this from the Atlassian viewpoint. We have been supporting the federal workforce for quite some time, and so we've been deep in a lot of these projects. If you look at a lot of the key initiatives that the government has going on, they're very different from one another, but they have a lot of common needs and requirements around them. Project management, enterprise service management, workforce management, even DevSecOps. So it's important to keep in mind all the cross-functional capabilities and needs to manage that as you move forward.
What are the successful organizations doing to tie all those pieces together, to kind of tie those strings together?
Yeah, I think one of the things they're doing is they're keeping in mind the larger ecosystem and the ripple effects of these projects that go through. Cross-functional teams, like I mentioned, it's probably more important than ever. There are a lot of different types of users out there, There are, first of all, there's government personnel, government civilian, you have armed forces personnel, you have contractors. Beyond that, there are technical users, there are non-technical users. Technical users may be involved in software development, they're tracking things like issues and bugs. Non-technical users, not so much. They're not in the technical work stream, but they're working on parallel work streams, and these areas do intersect. So fostering that collaboration, that management, and that visibility around all of it is probably more important than ever.
And I imagine it's also really important to make those things as opaque to the end user, to the non-technology people as possible, so they don't need to know, or probably want to know, what's going on behind the curtain, right?
Well, that's correct, right? You want to keep people in their workflows and focused on their initiatives, what they need to complete.
What are the organizations that are doing that well doing to kind of draw those lines of delineation?
So I think that when you think about how you manage all of these competing efforts, and sometimes they are competing in some ways, a comprehensive management platform and plan around how you manage that collaboration and how you keep people focused on their work streams is really important. Sometimes it may be preventing visibility into certain things. Other times it may take a management approach to say, hey, these two work streams are very important and they can't run solely independently, so we need to bring the teams together and work to achieve those outcomes.
That sounds like it's as much a cultural issue as a technological issue. The technologies probably are pretty much set, and it's the cultural issues that these organizations need to work through.
Oftentimes that's the case in a variety of organizations, not even just government, right? I mean, there's a lot of planning and you can buy a lot of tools, but if you have a cultural problem around collaboration, you're going to have further problems in delivering your outcomes.
You mentioned DevSecOps, and I wonder what your sense is of how integrated that concept has become into, especially the Defense Department, but the government more broadly. There's a period of time where that was kind of a clunky integration process.
Yeah, for sure. I think a good example are the software factories that DoD has stood up. It's no secret, DoD's been in the software business for a long time, and in a big way. They've shown tremendous leadership in standing up those software factories. And so, you know, developing, as they ramp and scale that outward, developing policy for how they're going to manage the collaboration and compliances within those projects becomes more important for sure.
One of the things that leaders tell me in DoD all the time is, I'm so focused on drinking from the fire hose, it's hard to think over the horizon. What would you tell somebody in the department that they should start to think about along the lines of what we've discussed, so that they're prepared for what's happening a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, Matt?
I think it's easy to get caught up in short-term deliverables and that type of vision, and you always have to keep that longer-term view. And it has to kind of be central for how you're managing things. You know, a dollar today is great, but let's look at the prize 2 years down the road. Also, I think it's easy to make decisions and plan and do planning in a bubble. And sometimes it's good to get a third party. I manage a pretty large partner network, and these partners have been enabling organizations around the globe to do exactly these types of things. So getting some outside thought leaders can also be very important.
Quick final thought before I let you go. What does this look like at some point in the future? DevSecOps, all these modernization pieces and so on. What's your sense of what a mature structure looks like?
You know, I think that there's the base. You have to get started somewhere. You have to build in all of your policies and your processes. And then from there, you just have to get to good. After that, it's that continual service improvement like they talk about with ITIL all the time.
Yeah.
Always trying to make it better. I think that's what mature organizations do. They don't establish something and then just roll with it forever. They're always continually improving that process.
You optimistic about what you're seeing in the department in that vein right now?
Absolutely. I mean, like I said before, they've shown tremendous leadership in what they're doing, and there's a wealth of talent within the government right now like we've never seen before.
Matt, it's great to see you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me on.
Matt Robertson of Atlassian at TechNet Cyber. One more break now. I'm back for more innovation in government in just a moment. If you want insights from agency and industry leaders on the latest topics in technology, management, workforce, defense, and acquisition, sign up for the FedGov Today podcast with me, Francis Rose. I release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, so you'll stay up to date on the issues that matter most to federal government leaders. Listen at fedgovtoday.com and everywhere you get your shows. Don't miss out on the conversation. Follow the podcast today. Welcome back to Innovation in Government. Identity is one of the pillars of the Defense Department's Zero Trust strategy. At TechNet Cyber, I asked Brian Rosenstiel, U.S. Federal Chief Technology Officer at Ping Identity, what agencies are doing well and what they're struggling with around identity management.
You know, one of the things that I'll say the agencies are getting better at is understanding what identity actually is. So a lot of times, wind the clock back even a few years ago, and when we talked identity, people would think identity, they would equate it to like, oh, my driver's license or my PIV or my CAC, right, that actual credential. And now people really understand we have to look at identity from the true definition, right? So identity being tools, processes, systems, to enabling the right person to access the right resource at the right time for the right reason, etc. And that really expands identity beyond simply who's that person behind the keyboard to everything that is involved from a digital identity perspective. What are they coming in from? How are they interacting with the system? What are they interacting with? What are they allowed to do? Such that that person's identity can change even while they're interacting within the system itself. And that very much fits into this whole kind of zero trust mindset and best practices about let's put processes in place to understand that digital identity and then put our access management capabilities around those types of best practices and thought processes. So we're getting better at retraining the way that culturally we view identity, and then of course that leads into better practices of how we're going to approach the security.
It sounds like for a long time agencies have been doing identity as a tactical thing, the CAC card or PIV card or whatever, and you're talking about it more like a concept. But people should think about it conceptually rather than tactically. Is that fair?
No, absolutely. Yeah, and we're changing identity too from, so to say what you say, from that tactical of, I've got just a piece of information, that information is contained on that card as an authenticator, and I'm going to use that to gain access, and then I know who's in the system. That is changing to authentication's merely the enabler of authorization. Authorization is what we really want to get at. Okay, we're going to have confidence, we're going to trust but verify who is the individual coming to the system, but now it's all about, okay, you are who you claim to be, and we verified that in authentication, but what do we know about you, and what should you be doing at this particular moment in time? That's what the actual laser focus is on. It's all around attribute-based access control. It's all about the different levels where ABAC is actually enforced, whether that level is going to be between the user and the application, call it inbound, whether that's going to be between the application and the actual data and resources, we call that outbound ABAC. That's down at the API level. So we're talking about getting really granular down into the weeds of this. The nice part about this is it allows us, once you have that foundation, now you can start expanding that out to beyond just your internal agency, but also to think of coalition partners, right? Think of our Five Eyes community. We cannot rely upon everyone having a CAC card because there are people who have to have access to the systems who simply don't have one. So how do we approach that? Well, we're going to approach it through these more dynamic and robust authorization protocols and schemas.
How does that inform the way that organizations should build systems architecture-wise? Right. And does it inform the way that they should acquire them through the acquisition process?
Well, I'm not sales, I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, well, they should buy this or buy that, but what it does do, it shifts the focus. When we know that for Zero Trust, they always say it's a journey, well, I always say you're not just wandering through a forest and smacking your head off trees, you know where you're trying to get. And so, again, it's this authorization, focus that we're trying to get to. To get there, we have to have things laid down, so you hear a lot about centralization through like federation and things like that, setting up the components, but it's also about the data. And it's a lot of, I don't have the time to go into it, but it's a big culture shift. The application owners can't be seen as, I own all the data in my application, but instead, organizations own that data, and now we have to do proper tagging, we have to have proper understanding, and from that we can build the access controls into it. That is, going back to the procurement piece, but refocusing the government on what they need to enhance and extend their existing investments they've already made to shore up those components before they start really doing the interconnected and interoperability components of those solution sets. And that's what Zero Trust is all about. Again, not rip and replace, but enhance and extend what we've been building for the last several decades.
Less than a minute left. What are the organizations that are doing this well doing? Are there common threads among what the successful organizations are doing?
Yeah, so organizations have come about this really in two different facets. One, taking authentication away from the application directly and standardizing the way that they're doing a connection over federation. That's super critical. Telling your applications, these are the ways that you're going to identify individuals, and not to get technical, that gets down into naming context within the federation standards. Then the other part about it is understanding, ultimately, I'm not trying to protect the identity, I'm trying to protect the data and the resource. Sometimes you're trying to protect identity in the government too, but that means I got to have better understanding of my data, where my data resides, who is accessing that data, and start tagging that data. Honestly, that's the hardest piece of this. The identity components, that exist. We have that out of the box in those integrations, but it's only as good as your data tagging and structure allows.
Brian, it's great to talk to you again. Thanks very much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Brian Rosensteel of Ping Identity on innovation in government. Another of the common themes at TechNet Cyber this year is resilience. I asked Michael Malloret, Director of Sales Engineering for Department of Defense at Veritas, if everyone defines resilience the same way.
Probably not, right? So I think what we try to look at is we look at, the different levels of capabilities that are assigned to the mission criticality of an application, right? So you have certain applications that you would tier 0, tier 1, the types that can never go down, right? And they need to be treated differently than you would treat, a tier 2 or even a tier 3 app. A tier 3 app, you might not even have to recover it for days, right? Where a tier 2 app, you want to be able to bring it back in hours, and a tier 1 app, you hopefully never have to have it go down. And if it does go down, you need to have the infrastructure behind it to be able to do a full disaster recovery, right? So we look at it from that perspective, and at Veritas we have multiple solutions to be able to create and protect those different tiers in different ways, right? Using different capabilities. So,
as you talk to your customers across government, not just in the DoD space as we're talking about at this conference, but all over the place, what are the biggest holdups that they're having to being in the position that you just described to be able to recover from these various states?
I think some of the biggest holdups is I don't believe that they actually perceive the concept of data protection as being part of the cyber resilience strategy, right? So we need to absolutely get better at getting customers to understand that it is part of that layered defense strategy. And in many cases it can be the absolute last line of defense, but there are things that we can do to be part of that strategy before you ever have to go to that too as well, right? Yeah.
What are some of the things that the organization should be doing, and what are some of the things that industry partners can do in that equation?
So great questions. I think one of the things that we are starting to see with some of the initiatives coming out of the government with the enforcement of NIST 800-171 through the CMMC program, right? As that evolves, I think that'll start to weed out some of the players that may not be up to speed to be able to support those mission critical applications and be part of that cyber resilient infrastructure. But more importantly, I think they have to start looking at the security posture of the company as a whole too, not just from a certification standpoint, but what they're doing with in the actual software framework, right? So when you think about the Executive Order 14028, where they started releasing requirements for the Secure Software Development Framework, software bill of materials, and things like that, companies are going to have to be able to respond to that appropriately, right? And then there's a very large push towards Zero Trust, and a lot of people talk about how they integrate with different pillars of the Zero Trust. I think it's more important that we start looking at solutions that are actually built with a zero trust mindset in the software application layer, right? And that's where you start to see the differentiation between, the true enterprise capabilities of somebody like a Veritas compared to some of the other competitors that are in the market.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about CMMC, because I think there are a lot of people on both sides, industry and government, that were worried that's going to become just a compliance exercise bolted on the way we've been talking about cybersecurity in government for 25 years, and not something that eventually became integrated. What drives that, do you think? What will make that work the way that the department envisions it?
Well, I think it will probably depend upon the criticality of the solution that you provide, right? So one thing that has definitely been determined from the executive order outputs is that data protection software, high availability solutions are deemed as mission critical, right? So they're in a classification of critical software. And I think the requirements on the critical software vendors are going to be greater than they will be on the others, right? And we've even had, recently we just had our, briefing for our security clearances, and, they recommended that because of what we do, that we actually even try to go for a CMMC level 3 certification, as opposed to the level 2 we were initially targeting based upon some guidance we got from some third-party organizations, right?
We just have a couple of minutes left. What do you see, what's the end state that you're anticipating, both for the department? Obviously, our stuff is secure as part of it, but what's the broader end state that you envision as this process plays out?
I believe that, we tend to, I think one of the challenges that government actually comes up with is they tend to release individual permits based upon a specific requirement. And those requirements don't necessarily always mesh together properly, right? So if you think about the end state that you want to be able to achieve, I think it has to be a more comprehensive approach of interoperability within the entire landscape. And that, I think, is going to require us to actually create new types of requests for information, and then ultimately RFPs that really make sure that there is that interoperability with individual applications. We have seen it a little bit in some of them where some particular vendor gets called out for another procurement where you have to be interoperable with that. I believe we'll probably see a lot more of that.
Mike, it's great to have you here. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Michael Malloret of Veritas. You can read more about all the topics that you heard about on today's Innovation in Government program at fedgovtoday.com. And you can watch the show again anytime on demand at our website too. I'm Francis Rose, the host of FedGov Today. Thanks very much for watching. If you want insights from agency and industry leaders on the latest topics in technology, management, workforce, defense, and acquisition, sign up for the FedGov Today podcast with me, Francis Rose. I release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, so you'll stay up to date on the issues that matter most to federal government leaders. Listen at fedgovtoday.com and everywhere you get your shows. Don't miss out on the conversation. Follow the podcast today.